you ever wonder why the same problems keep finding you? Different job, same conflict with your boss, different partner, same argument by month 3, different city, same loneliness. You change the scenery, you change the people. You tell yourself this time will be different. And for a while, it almost is. Then the pattern reasserts itself, quiet and inevitable, like a tide you didn't know you were swimming against. Most people blame the world. Bad luck, bad timing, people who didn't see their worth. And maybe some of that is true. But here's what nobody has had the courage to say to you directly. The most consistent variable in every situation where you've lost, every relationship that collapsed, every opportunity that slipped, every version of yourself you swore you'd become and didn't, is you. Not the circumstances, you. And more specifically, the structure inside you that is convinced it already knows who you are. Carl Jung, one of the most important psychologists who ever lived, spent decades mapping the terrain of the human psyche. And what he discovered about the ego was not what most people expect. It isn't arrogance. It isn't selfishness. In Aion, he wrote it plainly. The ego is the center of the field of consciousness, but it is not the center of the personality. It is a part of you, a fraction, a carefully edited fraction that learned, very early, which version of you was safe to be. The ego isn't the problem because it's too big. It's the problem because it believes it's the whole. And a part that believes it's the whole will defend itself against anything that proves otherwise, including the truth, including growth, including the people who love you enough to tell you what you don't want to hear. This is not a video about becoming more confident or learning to love yourself. I'm not here to flatter you. I'm here to show you the exact mechanism by which you keep getting in your own way, and why it feels, every single time, like something outside you is to blame. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because once you see how the ego actually operates, you will not be able to unsee it. And the moment you can't unsee it, everything about how you move through the world becomes available for change. So let me ask you something. What if the voice that sounds most like you is the very thing standing between you and who you could actually become? There is a distinction most people never learn to make. Not because it's complicated, but because making it is uncomfortable. The distinction is this. The person you know yourself to be is not the same as the person you actually are. This isn't a philosophical abstraction. It's a structural fact about how the mind works. Jung's framework in Aion is precise on this point. The ego, he explains, is the center of conscious experience. Every thought you're aware of, every memory you can access, every feeling you can name passes through it. But the personality as a whole is something larger, something that includes vast territories the ego cannot see. He called this totality the self. And the relationship between ego and self is not a partnership between equals. The ego is subordinate to the self, the way a map is subordinate to the territory it represents. The map is useful. The map is necessary. But the map is never the land. Here is where the problem begins. The ego doesn't know it's a map. It experiences itself as the full reality. Everything it hasn't charted simply doesn't exist, or gets labeled as foreign, wrong, not me. The most decisive qualities in a person, Jung observed, are often unconscious, perceptible only to others, or discovered only through sustained outside help. Which means the parts of you that most determine your fate are precisely the parts your ego has no access to. Think about the last time someone gave you feedback that made you immediately defensive. Not thoughtful, not curious, defensive. That reaction didn't come from reason. It came from the ego registering a threat to its map. The feedback was pointing at territory the map had either mislabeled or left blank. And the ego's first instinct, every time, is to protect the map rather than update it. This is the mechanism, not stupidity, not weakness. a structural bias towards self-consistency over self-accuracy. The practical implication is specific. You can begin to catch this in real time. The signal isn't anger. Anger can be legitimate. The signal is the speed of the dismissal. When you find yourself rejecting an observation about yourself before you've actually considered it, that speed is diagnostic. Something in you already knows the observation might be true and moved to close the door before you could look through it. The ego doesn't filter reality because it's malicious. It filters reality because consistency is its primary function. It was built to maintain a stable, coherent sense of who you are, and it will sacrifice accuracy to do it. That's not a moral failing, that's architecture. But here is what makes this architecture dangerous. It was designed for a version of you that may no longer exist. The map was drawn early, in childhood, in adolescence, in the years when you were still figuring out which parts of yourself were safe to show. The territory has changed since then. You have changed. The map hasn't. And you are still navigating your life, your relationships, your ambitions, using directions that were written for someone else's roads. So the question isn't whether your ego is distorting your perception of reality. It is. The question is, which distortions are costing you the most? That's what the next part will show you. Because the map wasn't just incomplete. It was built by editing something out. And what got edited out didn't disappear. It went underground. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. You were not born with an ego. You developed one. And the process was neither gentle nor neutral. The ego doesn't assemble itself from your authentic preferences and genuine qualities. It assembles itself from feedback, from the environment's response to who you were before you learned to manage yourself. The parts of you that were met with approval, with warmth, with safety, those got integrated. The parts that were met with rejection, with punishment, with silence, with shame, those got cut, not destroyed, cut from the official story. Jung was unambiguous about this in his clinical observations. The shadow, the repository of everything the ego has excluded, is not a collection of your worst impulses. It is a collection of everything that didn't survive the editing process. Sometimes that's cruelty, yes. Sometimes it's neediness, or rage, or the capacity for manipulation. But sometimes it's sensitivity, ambition, the desire to be seen. Parts that were too vulnerable, too inconvenient, too threatening to the people who shaped you. And so you learned, before you had words for the decision, to leave them out of the version you presented to the world. That version, the edited one, is your ego. And here is where the self-deception becomes architectural. The ego doesn't experience itself as edited. It experiences itself as complete. It doesn't say, I've excluded the parts of me that felt unsafe. It says, I am not that kind of person. The exclusion becomes identity. The defense becomes definition. This is why rationalization is not a bad habit you can simply correct with more discipline. It is a structural feature of how the ego maintains coherence. When something threatens the established narrative, a relationship that demands more vulnerability than the narrative permits, an opportunity that requires a version of you that was edited out years ago, a feedback that contradicts the official self-portrait. The ego doesn't evaluate the threat. It neutralizes it. Fear becomes practical concern. Avoidance becomes good judgment. Retreat becomes knowing your limits. The language is always reasonable. The conclusion is always the same. Stay as you are. Watch for this in your own thinking, not in moments of obvious fear, but in moments of suspicion. When you catch yourself building a very logical case for why you shouldn't do something that also, quietly, terrifies you, the logic deserves scrutiny. The ego is an excellent lawyer. It will always find a precedent. It will always construct a reasonable argument for the verdict it already decided on. The argument isn't the cause, it's the justification. The cause is the threat to the narrative. Jung described a patient in Aion who, after 25 years of compulsion neurosis that had cut him off from the world entirely, finally said, "But I can never admit to myself that I've wasted the best 25 years of my life." That sentence is the ego's logic laid bare. The refusal wasn't about the lost years. It was about what admitting it would do to the story he'd been telling himself about why his life looked the way it did. The ego will choose a painful story it controls over a liberating truth it doesn't. This is not weakness. This is not a character flaw. It is the ego doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting the coherence of the self-concept at almost any cost. The cost, in most lives, is enormous, because the edited parts don't stay quiet. They don't accept their exile. They find other ways to surface. In the relationships you repeatedly destroy, in the patterns you swear you've outgrown and haven't, in the inexplicable resistance you feel when genuine change gets close. The ego built the architecture, but the excluded parts are still in the building. And in the next part, we examine what they do when the ego isn't watching. Here is the thing about self-sabotage that nobody explains correctly. It doesn't feel like destruction. It feels like protection. It feels like the reasonable decision not to apply for the position you actually want because the timing isn't right. It feels like the mature choice to pull back from someone who's getting too close because you've been hurt before and you know how this ends. It feels like clarity. It feels like self-awareness. It is the ego operating at full efficiency. And it is costing you everything it's pretending to protect you from. Jung's framework makes the mechanism visible. The ego, remember, was built for consistency. Its primary function is not your happiness, not your growth, not even your survival in any deep sense. It is the maintenance of a coherent, recognizable self-concept. And coherence requires stability, which means that anything genuinely new, a relationship that demands you show up differently, a path that requires you to become someone the current narrative doesn't account for, a truth about yourself that doesn't fit the existing portrait, registers not as opportunity, but as threat. Not consciously. The ego doesn't announce its interventions, it simply produces results. Think about feedback, real feedback, the kind delivered by someone who knows you well enough to see what you can't. The ego's response to that feedback is rarely neutral. It personalizes it, minimizes it, or finds the flaw in the person delivering it. Not because the feedback is wrong, but because accurate feedback about your blind spots is, structurally, an attack on the map, and the map must be defended. Or think about intimacy. Genuine intimacy requires that another person see the parts of you that weren't approved of, the parts that got edited out early, the ones the ego has been quietly managing for years. The ego doesn't experience this as connection. It experiences it as exposure, so it generates distance, conflict over nothing, emotional unavailability dressed as independence, criticism deployed precisely when closeness peaks. None of this is calculated. All of it is structural. Jung wrote in Aion that the ego not only can do nothing against the self, it is sometimes actually assimilated by unconscious components of the personality that are in the process of development. What he meant was this. When the pressure for growth becomes strong enough, the unconscious doesn't ask permission. It acts through you, the relationship you sabotaged right before it required real vulnerability. That wasn't a decision. That was the ego executing its primary directive: keep the self-concept intact. The devastating implication is that your most self-protective moves are often your most self-defeating ones. The walls that kept you safe at 7 are the same walls preventing anyone from reaching you at 35. The self-concept that helped you survive an environment where vulnerability was dangerous is the same self-concept blocking the intimacy, the risk, the transformation that your actual life now requires. Here is the concrete test. Identify one pattern in your life that has repeated across different contexts, different people, different jobs, different circumstances, with the same outcome. Don't ask what went wrong externally. Ask what the ego had to gain from that outcome. What did staying stuck preserve? What change would success have required that the narrative couldn't accommodate? The answer will be uncomfortable. It usually involves becoming someone slightly unfamiliar to yourself. That discomfort is the ego doing its job. It is also, precisely, the feeling you need to learn to move through rather than away from. Which brings the question into sharper focus. If the ego can't be reasoned with, can't be overpowered, and can't be dismantled without creating new problems, what exactly are you supposed to do with it? The answer requires understanding what happens when the ego doesn't just defend its boundaries, but expands them. When it stops protecting a limited self and starts mistaking itself for the whole. Jung had a specific name for that condition, and it is far more common and far more dangerous than anything we've discussed so far. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. There is a condition more dangerous than low self-esteem, more insidious than obvious arrogance, and far more common than either. Jung called it inflation. And the reason most people never recognize it in themselves is that from the inside, it feels like clarity. Inflation is not the belief that you are better than other people. That's too crude, too easy to catch. Inflation is the unconscious identification of the ego with the self. The moment the part convinces itself, it is the whole. It is the quiet, unexamined certainty that the version of you that exists right now, with its current beliefs, its current limitations, its current story about why your life looks the way it does, is not a partial and provisional construction. It is simply who you are. And if this is simply who you are, then there is nothing to discover, nothing to revise, nothing to become. Jung was precise about the mechanics in Aion. When the ego assimilates unconscious contents without recognizing them as unconscious, when it absorbs what belongs to the deeper self and claims it as its own achievement, the result is an inflation that the person experiences not as grandiosity, but as groundedness. They don't feel puffed up. They feel settled. They feel like they've figured themselves out. And that feeling of having figured yourself out is, in Jungian terms, one of the most reliable signs that the work hasn't begun. This is what makes inflation so difficult to treat and so easy to miss. It masquerades as self-knowledge. You see it in the person who has a perfectly coherent explanation for every failure in their life, and every explanation points outward. The job didn't work out because the company was dysfunctional. The relationship ended because the other person wasn't ready. The opportunity passed because the timing was wrong. Each individual explanation might even be accurate. But the pattern, the unbroken, consistent pattern of an external world that keeps failing to recognize and accommodate you, that pattern is diagnostic, not of bad luck, of an ego so identified with its own narrative that reality itself has become an opponent. You also see it, less obviously, in people who have done some psychological work and stopped. They read the books. They went to therapy. They know the vocabulary of self-awareness. And they now use that vocabulary to explain themselves to themselves with a fluency that functions as a new kind of armor. The language of growth deployed in service of stasis. The map updated with better terminology, but still mistaken for the territory. Here is the check that inflation cannot easily survive. Genuine surprise. When was the last time you were genuinely surprised by yourself? Not pleasantly, but in the way that destabilizes something. When did someone's observation about you land not as confirmation of what you already knew, but as a revelation of something you had genuinely not seen? If that hasn't happened recently, It is worth asking whether the people around you have stopped telling you the truth, or whether you've stopped being accessible to it. Inflation contracts the world. Not dramatically. It doesn't announce itself. It simply makes the possible feel smaller, gradually, without your noticing. The risks that feel unreasonable, the people who seem incompatible, the opportunities that appear naive, the version of yourself that seems unrealistic. These contractions feel like wisdom. They are the ego enforcing its ceiling. Jung observed that the ego's position, until the discovery of the unconscious, had been absolute. It had been considered the center, not just of consciousness, but of the entire personality. Modern psychology displaced it from that throne. But displacing it theoretically does nothing if the ego simply reclaims the throne in practice, which is exactly what inflation allows it to do. The antidote is not self-attack. Turning on yourself doesn't deflate the ego. It just gives the ego a new story to organize around. Now you're the person who is deeply self-critical, which is its own form of self-preoccupation. The antidote is something more specific, more disciplined, and considerably more difficult. It is the development of a position inside yourself that can watch the ego without being the ego. A perspective that neither inflates nor demolishes, but observes. Jung called the process by which this becomes possible individuation. And the first step of that process is not insight. It is an encounter with exactly the thing the inflated ego most wants to avoid, the recognition that the map is wrong. Not incomplete, wrong, in specific, locatable, consequential ways. That recognition doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from learning to hold two positions at once, the ego's version of events and the possibility that the ego's version is a defense. That capacity to stand between what you believe about yourself and what might actually be true is what the next part is about. The question that arrives here is the one most psychology content refuses to answer concretely. If the ego distorts, defends, inflates, and sabotages, and if attacking it only gives it new material to organize around, then what, precisely, do you do? Jung's answer was not a technique, it was a capacity, and the distinction matters enormously. A technique is something you apply from the outside, a breathing exercise, a reframe, a journaling prompt you follow on Tuesday mornings and forget by Thursday. A capacity is something that develops inside the structure of who you are, something that changes how you process experience rather than just how you respond to specific triggers. What Jung pointed toward was the development of what he called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between the ego's position and the unconscious's counterposition without collapsing into either one. In plain terms, the ability to watch yourself think without fully becoming the thought. This is not dissociation. It is not detachment in the numb, defended sense. It is the development of a second position inside your own mind, a part of you that can observe the ego's moves as they happen, recognize the pattern in real time, and create just enough space between the stimulus and the response for a different choice to become possible. Not a better ego, an observer of the ego. The development of this capacity begins with something very specific. Learning to recognize the ego's signature moves in the moment they occur, not in retrospect. Retrospect is easy. Everybody can see their defensiveness after the conversation ends, their sabotage after the relationship collapses, their rationalization after the decision has been made and its consequences are sitting in front of them. Retrospective insight is genuinely useful, but it doesn't interrupt the pattern. It only narrates it afterward. What interrupts the pattern is catching the move while it's happening. The ego has tells. They are consistent because the ego is consistent. The first is the speed of certainty. The moment in a difficult conversation when you stop genuinely listening and start building your response. The moment ambiguity collapses into clarity faster than the situation actually warrants. The second is the quality of your comfort with a decision. Specifically, the relief that follows a choice to avoid something. Genuine peace feels different from the relief of having successfully avoided a threat. The ego's relief has a particular texture. It's slightly too quick, slightly too complete, and it tends to be followed, hours or days later, by a low-grade dissatisfaction you can't quite locate. The third tell is the most important and the subtlest. The moment you find yourself needing the other person to be wrong, not just disagreeing with them, needing them to be wrong, needing the conversation to end with your version of events intact. That need is the ego protecting its narrative. And the moment you can feel that need as a need, separate from the content of the argument, separate from whether you're actually right, you have created the distance that makes choice possible. This is the practice, not a meditation retreat, not a radical reinvention of your identity, not the dissolution of everything you've built, a daily, ongoing, unglamorous act of noticing. There goes the ego, closing a door. And then, not always, not perfectly, but sometimes, in the moments that matter, choosing to hold the door open a little longer than is comfortable. Jung was clear that the ego is not the enemy. In Aion, he described it as the necessary center of the field of consciousness. Without it, there is no coherent experience of being a person, no stable platform from which to act in the world. The goal is not ego death. The goal is ego transparency. A relationship with your own defensive structure clear-eyed enough that you are no longer entirely governed by it. What that relationship makes possible is not a life without fear, without resistance, without the ego's protective instincts firing. Those will always fire. What it makes possible is a life in which you are no longer obligated to obey them every time. The version of you capable of that is not the version you currently know. It has not been curated. It has not been made safe. It is larger than the story you've been telling about yourself. And it has been waiting, with considerable patience, for you to stop defending the smaller one. There is a particular grief that comes with this realization, and it deserves to be named before anything else. When you understand, genuinely understand, that the self you've been protecting so vigilantly is a construction, that the voice you've trusted most is also the voice most invested in keeping you recognizable to yourself, there is a moment of vertigo, not liberation. Vertigo. Because if the ego is a fraction, and you've been living as though it were the whole, then the life you've built around that fraction is also, in some significant measure, a life built around a limitation you mistook for an identity. Don't rush past that. Jung never promised that individuation was pleasant. He described it as a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, a process requiring confrontation with the dark aspects of the self as present and real, not as abstractions to be acknowledged and filed away. The shadow, the inflation, the defensive architecture we've examined here, these are not concepts to understand. They are realities to encounter, and encountering them requires something the ego is specifically designed to prevent: genuine uncertainty about who you are. The work is not dramatic. It happens in the accumulation of small acts of honesty the ego would prefer you not perform. The feedback you sit with instead of deflecting. The pattern you name without immediately explaining it away. The door you hold open slightly longer than is comfortable, even when everything in you is pushing it closed. Jung's insight, at its most essential, was this: the ego is not your enemy. It was your first solution to an impossible problem. How to be a person in a world that couldn't accept all of you at once. It got you here. But here is not where you're going. The question is not whether you can dismantle it. You cannot. The question is whether you can develop enough distance from it to stop confusing its voice with the truth, to hear that familiar, reasonable, self-protective voice and ask, without drama, is this the whole story? Or is this the part of me that needs the story to stay the same? You already know which patterns cost you the most. You've known for a while. The version of you that acts on that knowledge isn't somewhere in the future. It's available in the next conversation where someone tells you something you don't want to hear. In the next moment, you catch the door closing and choose, just this once, to hold it open. If what you heard in this video opened something that isn't finished yet, the video on your screen right now will take it further. Click and keep watching.